Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining our Path 4 breakout session. We really appreciate you being here with us. My name is McKenzie Smith. I'm Associate Director at the Climate Action Reserve, where I oversee our agricultural protocols in that sector. I also support our industrial sector, as well as a part of my policy role. I help review and manage our protocol concepts of new project type ideas. So very excited to moderate today's panel on the promise of emerging innovative carbon credit project types, where we will be discussing various project types in different sectors, their opportunities, the different challenges to scale in this market. I'm joined by three very knowledgeable panelists from different areas of the voluntary carbon market. I believe it'll be a great discussion to see different perspectives and hear directly from them as to what they're seeing in the pipeline and what the opportunities and challenges are. Before we jump in, I did want to briefly define a couple of things that I think will be relevant to our conversation. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know these definitions, but maybe will help set the stage. We may be discussing, or likely will be discussing, differences between reversible and non-reversible emissions. Obviously, reversible emissions are those that can be reversed or have a risk of being reversed, whereas non-reversible are avoided emissions that don't have that same risk or permanence requirements, as well as there are definitions like reductions versus removals when talking about reversible emissions as well. So before further ado and getting into some of the details, I will allow a few minutes for each of the panelists to introduce themselves, what organization they are representing, and a bit of background as to why they're interested in this space. So I'll start off with David LaGreca.
Thanks very much for hosting this, McKenzie. Really appreciate it. CAR does an awesome job with this event. I'm David LaGreca. I'm Managing Director for Voluntary Market Services with EcoEngineers. We're a globally focused decarbonization company. Our byline is we focus exclusively on the energy transition. My category of business is in the voluntary markets. Why we're all here today, and we have a growing practice across verification and methodology development, working with innovative and new project developers on the daily. We have very few cookie-cutter projects, and everything that comes to us is kind of weird, so this is going to be a great panel to be on.
Thanks, David. That's great. Mark?
Hi, my name's Mark Denne. I'm a little unusual in that I'm relatively new to this whole space. My background is as an angel investor. And I became involved here after being approached by a couple of companies that wanted to create NFT-related products for voluntary carbon markets. And as I started to delve into the world of voluntary carbon, I realized for all sorts of problems, it was going to be very difficult to do a straightforward angel investment program. And together with a colleague of mine, John Gant, who heads ICCF, which is a cross-party conservation organization in Washington, D.C., we decided to create an organization ourselves. The company is called Carbon International, and our job is to produce and sell in compliance markets offsets that we believe are so trustworthy that they can be traded in compliance markets. And the international part of the name is that we realize that with the current progress in the United Nations 6.4 committee, it may be only a matter of time before such trading can be genuinely international. But our first initiatives will be here in California, and it therefore means that our background is a little unusual, and therefore, in terms of innovation, hopefully there might be a little bit of fresh thinking coming from organizations such as ourselves, which we'll just humbly put before those of you who've been in this space a lot longer than I have.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. And last but not least, Danny.
Yes, my name is Danny Gray. I'm with a company called Eco Material Technologies. We're a producer of low-carbon cements. I've been working on technology that would allow us to produce a cement replacement material or an alternative supplementary cement, as it's referred to in the industry, which will take the place and basically avoid the need for Portland cement in ready-mix concrete. So for each ton of our product that we produce and move into an application, it displaces 1 ton of cement that had to be produced somewhere in the world or somewhere in the U.S. So that's the vantage point we come in from as a manufacturer of the alternative cementitious materials that are lower carbon footprint than traditional Portland cement.
Great. Well, thank you all for the introductions. I hope that gave you as the audience a nice view of the different perspectives we have on the panel today. And so we'll jump right in. My first question for the panelists is, with carbon markets expected to significantly increase, or we're seeing that grow and, recently and in the coming years, from their perspectives, what are new offset project types that you see being the most promising and why? So we'll start off with David again.
Thanks, McKenzie. So what I've seen for the last 2 years since I started up the category business at EcoEngineers is kind of a bifurcation in the market and now a realigning of the market. So it started off as being a very strong distinction between carbon dioxide removals and carbon dioxide avoidance. There was some infighting. Nature-based solutions versus industrial carbon removal and avoidance solutions. And I'm kind of seeing the opposite now. The companies who are formerly in one category are trying to merge across the different avenues, partially because buyer demand is indicating that they want a stronger sense of sustainable development goals to be mixed in, and some projects were so narrow focused on carbon removals or carbon avoidance that they didn't embody that. So I'm kind of seeing some reunification, which I think is hopeful for this market, and a little more unified progress towards our joint goals. In particular, the individual companies bringing unique technologies forward. I'm seeing that. We've got a couple of individuals here who can speak a little bit more closely, but I'm seeing a big, strong movement towards Scope 3 reductions with approaches that we're hoping to drive towards a Scope 1 quality of offset characteristics. So I'm seeing that along with a big demand in bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration, kind of as indicated by some joint work we did with Red Trail Energy on the incorporation in Puro Earth on the registration of large-scale carbon dioxide removal projects. There's a very strong influx from the ethanol industry in that right now, so that's significant. Biochar is also another very growing instance, along with technologies that are abating a particular emission source from a particular industry in the Scope 3. So trying to refine the reporting programs to legitimize claims within that sector is a very strong growth avenue that I'm seeing in this market, and I think it's really good that we're trying to get some legitimacy and some consistency in the reporting frameworks there. So that's kind of where a lot of my focus has been.
That's great. I think lay of the land to set off this discussion, both for the other speakers as well as some of the other project types we'll speak of, and it's timely. We also are just in the final stages of our development of our biochar protocol, so and looking at other project types that you mentioned. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mark, maybe for your perspectives and a little bit more detail on some of the things you're working on.
Yeah, I'd say 2 large trends that I can see having gathered momentum over the last 24 months or so. And then maybe we can talk about some of the details underneath those larger trends in response to later questions. The first trend that I see, which perhaps is going to be the most significant for all of us in this room, is a move away from avoidance-based offsets to what I've been calling absorption offsets, but which most people are calling removals offsets in this conference. The reason why isn't too difficult to understand. Those of you who've watched any of the sort of media programs related to avoidance offsets in the last 12 months will have seen the level of distrust which is emerging. I see that distrust primarily in sources of finance, where investors have become very leery indeed now of investing in avoidance-based projects and really want mechanisms by which they can focus their money and get a return from what they perceive as the much safer world of carbon removal offsets. And we'll talk about how some of those removal offsets have changed over the rest of this session here. The second big trend that I see, and this is perhaps one of the most controversial ones, is a trend away from voluntary market trading. Now, I know this is going to get me into trouble, so I'm going to say it anyway, and we can just have fun in the questions afterwards. But I believe that voluntary market prices reflect a fundamental shift away from the concept of voluntary market offsets, primarily because of fundamental economics rather than preference. If you look at, for example, the price of Red Plus offsets, there is no way that the current price of a ton of CO2 in the voluntary carbon market actually compensates a landowner for keeping a hectare or an acre of forest in place. The economics are just not there. If I was a landowner in South America, it benefits me much more to chop down that forest and put beef cattle in its place than it does to keep the forest in place and use Red Plus offsets to compensate me for leaving it there. The big difference in price is between voluntary market pricing and compliance market pricing. And as we look now at this trend, we see constantly much more interest in how can we as landowners, how can we as investors secure a pathway into compliance market trading. So that's the second of the two big trends that I see.
You've already given us a lot to think about, Mark. I hope people are already thinking of some questions, which is great. Yeah, please, David, go ahead.
I want to do a slight bit of pushback on
I know.
that point.
I know.
So I would say the fundamental characteristics of quality are not contingent upon the manner of which environmental benefits, that the environment has actually benefited. I'd say carbon avoidance versus removal. It's all a notion of the quality of the monitoring, reporting, and verification underlying and underpinning those claims. So, we've assessed probably about 40 different project types now over the past 18 months. Everything ranging from a particular type of device being installed to lower water flow, all the way through to direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering, biochar, you name it. And what I'm seeing is what drives companies to try to join the voluntary market is the same fundamental economics, the same environmental desires, but the assumption and presumption that all removals have quality that is superior to avoidance is not substantiated by the experience that we've had at EcoEngineers. I would say that the boundary setting can be skewed in the instance of bioenergy carbon capture, just as easily as it can be skewed in the case of a baseline determination of a forest. And it's only through careful consideration in each single project type that you can actually derive an inherent quality characteristic. And I think it's folly for this industry to assume that one is inherently superior to the other and inherently at need for our environment above other types.
Yeah, thanks, David. Appreciate that. I think that's a great addition to see what you're seeing maybe from buyer perspectives or what's perceived, and then maybe from verification or practicality within the actual protocols themselves or methodologies. And yeah, I'll say from like the Climate Action Reserve's perspective, of course we're working on both. I work on our agriculture, nature-based sector. I also work on our industrial sector, and so we see the being equally as important and benefiting the environment in both regards. So with that, I think we could round out the conversation with comments from Denne. We worked closely on our low carbon cement protocol that was recently developed and published, and it focuses on avoided emissions from the cement industry. So I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, as I said earlier, we come at it from a manufacturer's vantage point, and predominantly our company is U.S.-based centric, predominantly. And so from our perspective, the voluntary market is what we have access to, and that's an incentive program that is set up to try to drive investment in the lowest carbon production processes we can for the materials, in this case, cement, and that is a relevant factor for us in our investment decisions within the U.S. Once we knew that the carbon protocol would be established, that helped drive the economic decisions inside our organization. And the voluntary market is the market we work with and will deal with. So from our perspective, the things that are happening in our industry, there's a lot of R&D activities around, smaller level reductions in CO2 footprint of alternative cements. The project that we are working on and the type of cement that we developed is really focused on it's a step change in the reduction level. So where a lot of the technologies in the U.S. that are on the cutting edge are dealing with 15-20% reduction in CO2 footprint versus Portland cement, the process that we've developed is basically about a 90% or greater lower carbon footprint versus Portland cement manufacturing. If you think about it from the perspective in the U.S., about 70 to 80% of the cement utilized in the United States market comes from domestic supplies. The remainder is coming from offshore. The cement industry in the United States is predominantly controlled by foreign companies, so imports is historically been used in order to adjust for the economic curve. When you have an economic downturn, typically U.S. production cement would be the product of choice, and imports is reduced. But today, that shift is more to heavier imports for the United States. So obviously, the carbon footprint of the offshore cement is even higher than what it is in the U.S., and it has the transport factor involved. So, so from our perspective, what we focused on was manufacturing the cement that did not have high energy inputs, that did not have the natural carbon CO2 release from the actual carbonate that's used to manufacture Portland cement. So from our perspective, the protocol was instrumental in making decisions for low carbon cement rollout. And in our particular case, we're rolling out construction of our projects on a national basis in order to take that product. We've produced the product for 8-10 years at our original, what was an R&D facility that morphed into a small-scale production facility. So we know the product works. It's demonstrated in the marketplace. So fortunately for us, that once the protocol was to the point that we could use that incentive, it drove the investment decisions. So today we're rolling out the technology on a national basis and at some point international basis.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, I appreciate all your comments. I was just thinking of alternative questions based on what we had prepared and gotten into already, but I guess looking into a little bit more of what this session's all about in terms of new emerging carbon credit types. Obviously, I think we can all agree that there's a lot of new project types that are needed yesterday to address climate change and a lot of good ideas. And some of them are sequestration type projects or nature based, or others are industrial or other sectors. I guess my question is, what do you see as being some of the biggest hurdles or challenges in efficiently bringing these project types to market, being used, some of what Danny had already touched on for low carbon cement, but maybe Mark, from your perspective on some of the project types you're working on, where do you see the bottlenecks or the biggest challenges?
Yes, thank you, McKenzie. Well, continuing my role as the person to say the outrageous things, let's start with where we are right now in terms of carbon in the atmosphere. We know that we have passed the 400 parts per million measure of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we all know, I think we all know, that we can't do much about climate change without actively reducing the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. So to take a rather silly analogy, if we happen to be a witness to a car crash on the freeway, is our first thought, what must we do to avoid car crashes in future? Or is our first thought, what can we do to ensure that the people involved in this crash are safely transported to hospital and that the immediate impacts of the crash are mitigated as much as possible? So in terms of what is happening in the space of new carbon credits, I would say that our first priority must be to look at carbon credits that address that fundamental problem that there is too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, this is not to say that avoidance credits have no value. They're tremendously valuable. And we'll talk about this in a little bit as well when we talk about the question of how insetting, for example, can be used instead of offsetting, and specifically some of the points my colleague on the left here has said. But new offsets need to recognize the current reality that we must reduce the existing level of CO2. So that means we need to look at carbon absorption processes. What can we do to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as first priority? Not necessarily our only priority, but as first priority. And there are a great deal of opportunities available to us here. Some of them, unfortunately, are quite high energy opportunities in which we risk consuming as much in carbon equivalent on energy costs as we do in the amount of carbon we reduce from the atmosphere. But I would say my personal experience is that the industry is galvanized around solving that problem and finding offsets based around low energy DAC, low energy direct atmospheric absorption of carbon. There are at least half a dozen techniques in this area which are being explored at the moment. And I've been fascinated to see that even research papers in this area have ended up having media coverage. And we can talk about a few of those a little bit later as well, and I'll be happy to answer questions about them. It's not often that PhD researchers in areas like this find themselves on television immediately after publishing their papers, but perhaps that is an indication of the level of public interest in this new generation of innovative removals-based carbon offsets.
Maybe I'll go to David. I guess same question, like challenges, barriers to adoption. From your vantage point, I'm sure you see a lot of different concepts, some of them avoidance, some of them sequestration. There's obviously just administrative challenges with getting project type adopted at a registry and functional and being implemented, and considerations within those methodologies of how market ready it is. Any comments from the different types of project types and hurdles there from your perspective?
Yeah, the market-based administration work to get a registry draft, to get a methodology drafted, submitted to a registry, accepted, and then adopted, credited, verified. That's definitely a lot of the work, but the front end work, the kind of pointy end of that spear, is the analysis of the technological or project readiness. I would say that's kind of where we spend a lot of time assessing whether the project is actually creditable, and that's an important gatekeeping operation of registries. But we're kind of finding that in order to justify to investors, and you probably have some perspective on this as one, but there's you have to have depiction that there is a scientific underpinning of the new type of carbon removal opportunity, and make sure that it is actually going to be climate relevant and going to actually achieve the ambitions that it's supposed to. And then the second step is to prove that out through your monitoring and reporting activities, and then to make that verifiable. So breaking it down into you've written enough methodologies to know that there's a lot of steps to it, and that every single project needs to be able to follow the same process to get there to repeat the cycle. So I think that's one of the hurdles, is just the process, how long it takes versus the funding cycles and the goals, the ambitions of quarterly or annual returns on investment, especially for pioneering new project types that are going to take 4 years for the pilot to come to fruition, and then another decade for them to come to full scale. I don't know if you guys have ever talked to a carbon dioxide removal company, but every one of them is gigaton scale. Some of them are going to get there, some of them are not, and I think being able to prove that's a major hurdle. Registries, we are actively harassing all of them to accept the ones that we have validated on our own, to make sure that there is some kind of pathway out there. I would say the urgency is, in my perspective, to do it all at the same time, and I don't think we're in a zero-sum type of environment. There's enough investment coming right now where we can fund all the opportunities for methane abatement that might keep us within the 2-degree 2-degree ambition, because we're kind of losing on the 1.5-degree ambition, while at the same time working towards 2030, 2040 goals of undoing some of the damages already done through high-quality investments and carbon removals as well.
Yeah, really interesting perspectives. All things I think that we consider at our registry at the Reserve when looking at new concepts and seeing their merit and the overall impact on fighting against climate change and project emissions, as well as the quantification and all of those areas. So appreciate that perspective. Danny, I know we were in the weeds on the low carbon cement protocol. Obviously, you came into it with your experience and background on, cement, alternative cement product manufacturing and the day-to-day. Any comments generally from yourself on as a part of the work group, learning more about the expectations of the voluntary carbon market from data collection to, proof of statements and those types of things? Any hurdles that you were surprised by, expected, and how you as a company are going to face those?
Sure. I'll back up and just add one
Sure, of
follow-on
course,
comment
please.
to the hurdles. As we know, the construction materials industry is a industry where it doesn't accept or make changes quickly. The cement manufacturing process that we use today for modern-day cement was invented 200 years ago, and it's essentially hasn't changed. The underlying physics is the same today as it was 200 years ago. So where we approached it was to look at what the Romans and Greeks did, because that's the oldest standing man-made structures with concrete in them. And we went backwards and said, what's the distinction between modern-day cement and old-age cement? So that was the angle we worked at, was to unlock that technology advance and try to work with it. Now, in terms of working on the work group for the protocol, obviously, there is a lot of data that goes into verification of our, energy inputs for what we make, and of course, where the savings are from electricity, gas usage, or in our case, solar energy uses mixed with electricity off of the grid. So that, that was an eye-opener from our perspective, being relatively new to the process, was all of the data that has to be collected and will be verified. We're just at the beginning of project submission for verification, so that process, we'll go through it for our first time now and learn a lot as we go. But there is, the one thing that hit me was the amazing amount of data that has to be collected, verified, and observed, and tracked in your production process as well as the material. We know, historically, that cement, what it takes to make cement and what the carbon footprint of that is. The alternative cement processes that we are using, we know what that is, so the data's there. So it was just, how do we formulate the easiest way to get that data so that it's visible and verifiable? So.
Yeah, I appreciate both those comments. Thanks, Danny. I'm mindful of time. I want to try to leave 15 minutes if we can for questions. So I think we'll probably do one more round table on the last topic I have written down here, which is on pressures from supply chains or scope 3 insetting, all of those words that we hear. I'm interested to hear from the speakers as to what motivations, how that impacts different project types being accelerated, if there's an agricultural supply chain of food production and that's of most interest, or maybe from cement manufacturing and buildings and the end use of the product, and how that is driving or motivating certain project types over others. So I think I'll start maybe with David again, if that's okay with you, and just move down the speaker list.
Yeah, so I think that's been, like I said earlier on, there's a lot of demand for just companies trying to figure out what types of crediting strategies that are out there. So taking a quasi-existentialist approach of this, it's like, do you have to get a carbon offset credit through XYZ registry, or do you need to drive revenue in any way possible? Your investors may or may not believe in offsets. They may or may not believe in some type of renewable energy credit. They may or may not believe in any of these approaches, and what you need to do is present the realm of opportunities. And that's one thing that taking a different approach is to see if you have a low carbon production process. So many companies come to us and they frequently use like the wrong terms, like, hey, I need an LCA, hey, I need a verification, hey, I need something. But really what they need is they need to find a way to monetize their production process. They need to monetize this attribute that they have. And so taking a step back and kind of looking at their product from like, where do you sit in the supply chain? How many credits are you going to generate? Is there an existing process already out there that we can cut and paste you into? And if not, then is it going to be worth is the juice going to be worth the squeeze for going through this entire production activity of developing an innovative new methodology? At some point, you're going to have to validate and prove your concept, but if it's going to be a very tailored solution for agriculture, which we're seeing right now, like projects that don't have or projects that are maybe possibly existing activities who might not have the same level of additionality to obtain an offset credit, but they still have an impact on the scope 3 of the agricultural major, to be able to put some hard and fast values and to prove out that those processes are actually efficacious in reducing the footprint in that category. We're seeing a lot of interest in agriculture, a lot of interest in food waste avoidance, and then also like in building materials. That's another one that overlaps well with you guys. And I think there's challenges in trying to, if somebody comes in and asks for like an offset and, having to tell them that there's not an offset pathway. Climate Action Reserve has 10 protocols and not one of them is in your category. There's 170 that have been produced through CDM and elsewhere, but you're doing something new. And so many of these new project types illustrates the level of interest in advancing decarbonization across industry, but not all of them are going to be a plug and play for one approach or another.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We're obviously seeing a lot of different motivations in the market and within supply chains. Maybe that leads into you, Danny, with some comments from like the building, sector, and you obviously have customers that are purchasing these, alternative SCM, ACM products. What are your thoughts on those customers, from an end user standpoint or supply chain or in setting where they're going to claim those quantifiable emission reductions that they're able to then purchase your product and I guess offset the cost from that perspective versus what we've worked on together and have at the reserve now where it's a voluntary, offset credit where you're getting that up front and it's driving the investment and capital, expenditures or whatnot.
Sure. Well, the concrete industry and the cement manufacturing, it's a fairly complex supply chain that starts with wherever the cement plant is, and then the cement gets transported and delivered to wherever the concrete production is actually at. Most of you have seen ready-mix trucks going up and down the highway, so you know what a concrete delivery truck looks like, and that's the end product that you'll be buying for your residential construction or your driveway into your home, or either it's going to be in the highways you're driving over every day, or either in commercial and industrial, commercial type construction. In the U.S., about a third of the concrete in general is used for residential construction, about a third is used for commercial and industrial construction, and about a third goes for infrastructure type construction, so highways, bridges, that type of infrastructure. So pretty complex supply chain, and in each part of that supply chain, there's decision makers that will decide which products they are. In the U.S. now, we're seeing good, strong trends towards asking for, within specifications, for public projects or either, private projects, whether they be industrial or commercial. There's a lot of emphasis now on reducing the embedded CO2 footprint of the finished product, the concrete's delivered. So ready-mix companies in some case feel that they're the ones making the decision process and they should be the supply chain developer or either the owner of a carbon credit in terms of monetization under a protocol. What the protocol that was published is set up for is to try to incentivize the manufacturer of the product that will lead to it, because if we can have a 1 ton of cement that has a really low carbon footprint that displaces 1 ton of cement, once it displaces it, that's one ton of CO2 savings that got offset somewhere in the world, and in particularly closer to the distribution point. So in our case in the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, 70, 75, 80% of our cement utilized in the U.S. is domestic produced, and 25 to 35% is foreign. So we know every ton of material that goes out there, regardless of where the carbon credit ownership is and where it gets monetized, but that offsets 1 ton of cement not having to be manufactured, and therefore roughly 1 ton of CO2 emissions is avoided. So from our perspective, the supply chain is pretty complex. The protocol is very, very specific in terms of how it tries to incentivize the construction or the production of low carbon incentives. But at the end of the day, you're talking about cement, which is an integral, most important ingredient that goes into concrete, and concrete is ubiquitous in our modern day lifestyle. So.
Thanks. Yeah, I know from both a cement, concrete standpoint and also agriculture and food that traceability is a whole other question mark of trying to follow that product through its supply chain. So it can add complexity. Mark, any thoughts on the different pathways and how those motivate different project types?
Yes, of course. Let's get real about insetting for a moment. Again, as a new entrant, I've had to learn a lot of new vocabulary, and not everyone in here may understand exactly what insetting is. So what's happening in insetting is that an organization is changing its supply chain practices to minimize the amount of carbon dioxide emission or methane emission that occurs as a result of those practices. So it's still an avoidance mechanism, but it's a very important avoidance mechanism because it's being done in-house under the full control of the organization that owns the supply chain. And there's a level of accountability which would not be present if it was compared with, for example, offsetting, where an emitter is using somebody at a distance beyond arm's length to compensate for their CO2 emissions by absorbing an equivalent amount elsewhere. Now, I noticed that the Insetting Forum has actually defined a rather neat way of describing what insetting is all about by saying it's about doing more good rather than less bad. Now, I find this rather an interesting choice of phrase because it reminds me of a comedy program called W1A, which those of you who are familiar with British comedy television may recall from a few years back, in which the BBC lampooned itself by creating a comedy program about its own approval processes for different productions. And they invented a director of better. And the director of better's job was to do more things better and less things bad. And it reminds me of the difficulty with insetting, because if you have a choice between doing more things better versus less things bad, it's not that easy. It depends how well you're going to do something better, doesn't it? Compared to how bad you're going to do something bad. And if you are an agricultural organization, suppose you own a farm, I would say I fully applaud you as a farmer in wanting to look at insetting techniques that enable you to reduce the amount of methane that your cows are emitting, or reduce the amount of spurious carbon dioxide that's being emitted as a result of your farming practices. But suppose you could do something even better. Something that enables you not only to completely offset that emission, but to do direct carbon dioxide capture from the atmosphere at a volume and a rate which exceeds the emissions that you were creating before. In other words, your organization doesn't just look at minimizing emissions in the supply chain, but can it create a little carbon zero economy within itself? And as we look at these new types of offsets that are emerging around carbon absorption from the atmosphere, particularly in the agricultural space, the opportunity is now opening up for farmers to use their land in such a way that they capture more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than they were ever emitting through their suboptimal processes in the first place. Not an excuse to avoid optimization of those processes. Let's encourage everybody in all industries to optimize their supply chain and to go out to the market with credits associated with the avoidance of those processes. But the opportunity exists to do something even better, and that's the point that I'm making.
Interesting point, and from a registry who's developing offsets, I will have to say, you know, we strive to generate high quality offsets, of course, and you know, we from the reserve see it. I think from an accounting perspective, it should be robust quantification. It should be, you know, a ton of CO2 equivalents, and then it comes down to ownership, I think, to an extent of if it's within or outside of your supply chain, but definitely interesting takes, and I'm sure there's hopefully going to be a lot of questions. Any responses, David or Denne, to Mark's comments, or any kind of closing remarks you had thought of that we didn't touch on that you'd like to share before we open it up for questions?
Go for it.
Well, from my perspective, we view it that the world is generating about a little over 4 billion tons of cement each year is what's manufactured. In the United States, we consume over 100 million tons of cement every year. Those are Portland cement that is manufactured with an emission factor attached to it. So my goal, or our vision, is that if we can reduce that total number of tons of Portland cement that's used or manufactured in the United States, whatever ratio we can reduce that is an improvement in the right direction, and that's really our central focus. And to the extent that the carbon protocol that's now established has helped incentivize movement in that direction, one step at a time is the way we approach it. So.
Fair enough. Thanks, Denne. David, do you want to close this out?
Yeah, I think the carbon credit market is a fascinating study in human psychology. I really think we. It is. It is because it has everything from science to sustainable development goals to cancel culture, all baked into one. And it's absolutely fascinating to me. And I think that if we can find a way to not destroy ourselves by saying this is better than that, and you deserve credits and I don't, but we have like a common threshold of acknowledgement of the risks, the uncertainties, and the absolute value that we are providing to the atmosphere and to the earth and to the people involved in these projects, I think we're gonna have a lot better outcome. And utilizing the best available science, the best available registration practices, and taking the corporate approach for scale and advancing things, and kind of grinding that slowly through the process of the innovation guardrails that the voluntary carbon market has been so good at before. I think that's our real option here, and that's kind of what we strive to do every day with Josh and Steve and the rest of our eco team. So and then working with groups like you guys to make that happen. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's a great way to wrap up the discussion. We touched on a lot. Hopefully, gave you lots to think about in 45 minutes. And like we said, we wanted to leave a good chunk of time for questions. So I know two of my colleagues have microphones. So if you feel like you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and they'll come to you with a mic, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. But thank you to our three speakers first, and yeah, thank you for joining us. Questions?
Hey, nothing controversial happened.
Wow, we thought we would have stirred. Oh, there we go.
I have a question for Mark. You mentioned earlier that the hope for the voluntary market to get profitable capital formation is the pathway to compliance. What do you mean by that, and how do you envision that happen?
So as you know, the voluntary market has a series of protocols, and there are three major protocol organizing corporations or non-profit corporations, of which one is represented here today, CAR. It's my firm belief that the protocols that have been established for avoidance offsets can translate into the compliance market. There's going to need to be some appropriate legislative support, but individuals and organizations that are producing under protocols that are established today in order to gain credits in the voluntary market, I believe the pathway to success is for those same compliance protocols and the same accreditation agencies to begin to increasingly turn their attention towards the compliance markets. We have a tremendous advantage here in California in that three of those organizations, and CAR is one of them, is already declared by the California Air Resources Board to be a trusted and approved accreditation agency for compliance offsets. And therefore, all the work that McKenzie and her team do in creating voluntary market protocols will eventually become especially important in the compliance market, where those protocols will accredit the same processes and enable them to achieve the much greater rewards that come from selling into the compliance markets.
I'll add, it's interesting perspective. Of course, we do work in both, as most of you know. I think we all at the Reserve think there are opportunities still in the voluntary market. So interesting perspectives, of course, and then that's why we want to provide different perspectives and have your questions. But we don't necessarily see them as the same. We have two areas that we're working in.
I'm Serge Denne, Executive Director of Wild Coast Costa Salvaje. We work in the natural climate solution space, trying to grow mangroves, which goes slowly. But first, Danny, thanks for your dogged optimism and focus. So I think that's important. And then, Mark, so what I'm hearing, and I'm trying to take away how we apply this to mangroves and saving the planet, but what I'm hearing is quality does count. So we're using mangroves as a way, growing mangroves as a way to incentivize communities to protect existing mangroves or forests. So you're saying is double down on the quality. Maybe we're scaling up, but that's kind of like the future that you see. Is that correct in the natural climate solution space?
Absolutely. Doubling down on quality has to be the message here, because if quality does not engender confidence in the investor space, you won't get the money flow that you need to be successful. At the end of the day, whether you like it or not, operating in the capitalist system means that you need to have a method by which there is a profit motive in place to get the funding that you need to achieve the economic and ecological outcome that you're looking for. It's organizations like CAR which are going to be key to that, because if it were not for a focus on quality, taking your point about it's an interesting exercise in human psychology, I fear that fear will take over and those money flows won't happen.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, David, you said it earlier in our discussion that the quality on either type of protocol, whether it's a type of protocol that falls under an avoidance or industrial protocol like cement or nature-based, the quality is what's being demanded by the market, I think, across the board. Obviously, we see the core carbon principles coming out by ICBCM, and those can apply to any protocol type, not just nature-based or not, other types. So I think that's important, but great question. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, Josh Butler, ExxonMobil. Thanks for the discussion. Just if I add one word up here to the title, if I add category, maybe. So innovative carbon credit category types. So I heard when I walked in, I think I heard biochar. I think we've heard DAC. There are 12 different ways to implement DAC. And then I think I heard BECS. In my opinion, those are some innovative, newer carbon credit categories that we're paying attention to. With the expertise on the panel, what are some other innovative category types that we should be paying attention to, either in pipeline or maybe developed?
I can start. So like some other categories would be industrial improvements. So ExxonMobil, companies similar to yours, are doing rapid decarbonization in certain instances, much frequently using existing technologies. But that's a recent advent, which is fantastic to see. I think open systems, nature-based solutions adjacent industrial removals is a broad category. Open systems removals in oceans, everything from sinking seaweed that is growing in the Atlantic sargassum belt to ocean electrochemicalization, which is a category of removals which is growing. Enhanced rock weathering, which you alluded to on farms. So I'd say open systems is its own category with many hurdles that we need to overcome, and I think that's as big of a category as the industrial and product level reductions. And each of these companies are trying to use the carbon markets to reach maximum potential growth, and we're finding that there's a lot of complexities that cannot be answered so easily and in such a short time frame. So the market and Frontier and other types of buying groups like that are reaching out and with a leap of faith that these projects are going to be fully justifiable in the short term, and we're trying to make sure that we don't get out ahead of our skis in some of these endeavors before they are actually truly creditable.
I'd suggest that enhanced rock weathering has reached the stage where it's a category in its own right now, in that there are so many processes that are being tested and evaluated. Again, for those of you who, like myself, are still getting up to speed with all the terminology, enhanced rock weathering is basically the distribution onto the soil of material which directly absorbs carbon dioxide through a chemical process, creating salts in the soil which capture the carbon. Those salts may then be leached out to the oceans, and there's some questions, therefore, about how we manage that leaching and is it even bad. But there are so many options for doing that type of very low energy carbon capture that, to your point, it may be a category in its own right now.
Great, thanks. Questions?
Hi, Jeff Wallen from the Biochar Impact Company. I'm reminded, listening to all this, that humans, despite our many inventions and artistic pretensions, we owe our entire existence to 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. 93% of all delivered carbon credits in 2023 were biochar-based. That's the delivered credits. And the soil can hold 5 times more carbon than the atmosphere. So any ideas? It was great to hear the Exxon guy mentioned biochar, by the way. Any thoughts from you guys on biochar and soil from an organic perspective?
Can I pick up the biochar point? I'm really very interested in biochar. And as McKenzie knows, one of the things that I want to try and do as much as possible is to combine protocols that have been created for biochar with other techniques such as enhanced rock weathering, and to see if we can establish basically a kind of springboard from the protocols that are in progress for biochar to put in place protocols that will survive in the compliance markets for direct carbon capture. As far as biochar goes as a mechanism, I would want, very unfairly, I'm sure from your perspective, to put that into the enhanced rock weathering category. Technically, of course, it's not rock weathering, but it is capturing carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere and has some real benefits in terms of permanence, which may well end up establishing biochar as a very successful technique going forward, as I suspect that at the moment, although we spend a lot of our time talking about baselining, in 2 years' time, we may be spending all of our time talking about permanence, and there biochar has a tremendous advantage.
I have an interest in your question. I work on our soil enrichment protocol at the reserve, and colleague John Remicall just finalized our biochar protocol, so it'll be interesting to see how those interact with each other. Two different project types, I guess, but one supply chain, maybe. Other questions? Less than 5 minutes, probably could take one or two more. Okay. Oh. Okay, well, thank you all for attending. We really appreciate your time. Thanks again to our speakers, and we'll be up front.